The room is dimly lit, and our story tonight dwells in the shadows between two presidencies. It's a story of covert connections, whispers that link John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon through secret operations, code words, and a cast of characters who drift in and out of history's dark alleys. We're not spinning a wild yarn. We're carefully pulling threads that just might connect the Bay of Pigs invasion, the JFK assassination, and the Watergate scandal. And in this skeptical telling, I'll walk that fine line between documented fact and the unsettling questions that arise from those facts. Think back to 1960. Vice President Richard Nixon is a rising Cold Warrior under Eisenhower. Behind closed doors, Nixon is intimately involved in plotting against Fidel Castro's young revolutionary government in Cuba. He lunches with a wealthy associate of ousted Cuban dictator Batista and urges President Eisenhower to take action against Castro. In fact, by early 1960, Nixon was pushing for Castro's overthrow. He even allegedly promised millions of dollars to Cuban exiles to finance an anti-Castro effort. Inside the National Security Council, Nixon lobbied hard for covert intervention in Cuba. President Eisenhower gave a nod to covert action, and the CIA's plan to arm and train Cuban exiles quietly moved ahead. Nixon, as VP, was in the loop on these early plans for what would become the Bay of Pigs invasion. Years later, Nixon himself recalled, "I know what happened with the planning of the Bay of Pigs under Eisenhower and totally approved it," unquote. A point of pride for him, perhaps, since he felt President Kennedy botched the operation when the time came. But Nixon's involvement went even deeper into the shadows. It appears he had a hand in truly dark schemes. According to JFK's press secretary Pierre Salinger, a private CIA contractor named Robert Mayhew confided that Vice President Nixon personally authorized a top-secret project, teaming up with mafia leaders to assassinate Fidel Castro. Salinger said Nixon, quote, asked the CIA to go forward with this project and had Mayhew, quote, do a deal with the mafia in Florida to kill Castro. We later learned that in 1960 the CIA did enlist mobsters like Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, and Santos Traficant to plots to poison to shoot Fidel Castro. So think about that, a sitting vice president greasing the wheels for a CIA mafia murder scheme. Nixon's own White House counsel John Dean later confirmed that Mayhew was indeed the point of contact for the CIA's effort to have the mafia assassinate Fidel Castro in the early 1960s. In other words, Nixon's fingerprints were all over some of the most sensitive covert operations of the era, before JFK ever took office. It should be no surprise then that E. Howard Hunt, yes, the same Hunt who would become infamous in Watergate, was one of the CIA's planners for the Bay of Pigs invasion. Hunt was a CIA political warfare specialist who had helped orchestrate the 1954 coup in Guatemala, and by 1960 he was busy plotting Castro's demise. According to investigative author Don Folsom, when Nixon was vice president, he and then CIA agent Hunt were principal secret planners of the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. Nixon and Hunt even worked on an accompanying project to assassinate Castro, recruiting underworld hitmen so that if the plot unraveled, blame could fall on the mob rather than on Washington. This was cloak and dagger work of the highest order. The plotters included CIA officers, Cuban exile militants, and mafia killers, a motley crew with a shared mission. And here's where things start to interlace with the Kennedy saga. Many of those same cast of characters would surface again later, under markedly different circumstances. Fast forward to April 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion, planned under Eisenhower and Nixon, executed under Kennedy, crashes in spectacular failure. JFK refuses to send U.S. air support to save the operation, feeling misled by the CIA's over-optimism. The CIA and anti-Castro exiles are furious. Kennedy privately swears to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces after this fiasco, and he does fire CIA Director Allen Dulles. Meanwhile, Cuban exiles and their CIA mentors feel Kennedy betrayed them by pulling punches at the critical moment. Many CIA officers and Cuban exile soldiers blame JFK for the Bay of Pigs disaster, seeing his restraint as treachery. Nixon, watching from the sidelines after losing the 1960 election, echoed that view. He griped that if only Kennedy had flown a couple of planes to support the exiles, Castro might have been toppled. Now let's consider Dallas, 1963. President Kennedy is assassinated, a cataclysmic event rife with speculation. Among the myriad conspiracy theories, one of the prominent lines of inquiry points back to those same covert networks, the Bay of Pigs veterans, the CIA hardliners, the mob, and the anti-Castro Cubans. The House Select Committee on Assassinations noted that, quote, CIA operatives and anti-Castro Cuban exiles were indeed among the suspect groups often named by critics of the Warren Commission. And intriguingly, Watergate burglar Frank Sturgis, who had been a soldier of fortune in anti-Castro missions, had strong ties to all three communities that Kennedy conspiracy researchers eye suspiciously: organized crime, CIA paramilitaries, and Cuban exile militants. In fact, Sturgis himself admitted those connections. By his own account, he had worked with Castro's revolution, then against it, he'd mingled with mobsters, and he'd been on the CIA's radar for years. Allegations about a Sturgis link to JFK's death might have circulated for half a century, as one journalist put it, though Sturgis always insisted he was in Miami on the day of the assassination. He wasn't the only Watergate figure to fall under suspicion for Dallas. E. Howard Hunt, the former CIA man and future Watergate plumber, was accused by some of being involved in the JFK plot as well. In the 1970s, rumors swirled that Hunt and Sturgis were among the mysterious three tramps photographed near the scene in Dealey Plaza. Hunt actually filed a libel suit in 1975 to clear his name of these assassination allegations. Decades later, near his death, Hunt's own son recorded him alluding to a conspiracy, naming off CIA figures and claiming knowledge of a plot he dubbed the Big Event, with Lyndon Johnson in the wings. Though Hunt's so-called deathbed confession is disputed, the fact remains, by the time Congress reinvestigated it, these overlapping personnel were impossible to ignore. Congress's HSCA concluded that Kennedy was likely assassinated as the result of a conspiracy, without endorsing a specific culprit, but explicitly stated the committee found no hard evidence of CIA involvement. Still, CIA officers like Hunt and alleged assets like Sturgis were investigated. Now let's zoom in on Watergate itself. June 17, 1972. A team of burglars is caught red-handed inside the Democratic National Committee HQ. Who were these men? As it turned out, they were not ordinary burglars at all. The arrested operatives included James McCord, a recently retired CIA security officer, and 4 Cuban-American Bay of Pigs veterans: Bernard Barker, Eugenio Martinez, Virgilio Gonzalez, and Frank Sturgis, all of whom had CIA ties or who had worked directly under CIA handler E. Howard Hunt in the past. Hunt himself and ex-FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy supervised the break-in from a hotel across the street. Think about that. The Watergate burglars were virtually an alumni reunion of the Bay of Pigs operation. As one account Riley noted, the Miami contingent on the team had already been involved in planning the failed CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba 11 years earlier. The burglary crew was stocked with career intelligence operatives, soldiers of fortune, and Cuban exile adventurers, a pickup team of Cold War covert operatives carrying out a political espionage mission on U.S. soil. When Nixon learned that some of his men, people tied to his administration or campaign, were behind the Watergate break-in, he exploded in rage, but very quickly gave way to calculating fear. Nixon realized this scandal could unravel everything. On June 23, 1972, days after the arrests, Nixon hatched a plan to pressure the CIA to block the FBI's investigation. In a now infamous White House tape, the so-called smoking gun tape, Nixon instructs his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, on how to lean on CIA Director Richard Helms. Nixon tells Haldeman to remind Helms about E. Howard Hunt and say, if the FBI keeps pushing, it's likely to blow the whole Bay of Pigs thing. Hunt knows too damn much, Nixon warned, and if investigators pried too deep, it could expose something explosive, the whole Bay of Pigs thing. What did Nixon mean by that? Haldeman later revealed that, quote, in all those Nixon references to the Bay of Pigs, he was actually referring to the Kennedy assassination, unquote. It was, Haldeman wrote, a private code, the president's way of reminding Helms, not so gently, of CIA assassination attempts on Castro, a CIA operation that may have triggered the Kennedy tragedy, and Helms desperately wanted to hide. In other words, Nixon was hinting, back off, or we all risk dredging up secrets about Cuba and JFK. According to Haldeman, Nixon knew of a darkest event in our history tied to the Bay of Pigs story. In Haldeman's view, Nixon was effectively blackmailing the CIA. If Langley didn't help shut down the Watergate inquiry, Nixon might expose what he knew about Dallas. When Haldeman dutifully conveyed this warning to Helms at the CIA, Helms' reaction was telling. Normally unflappable, Helms gripped the arms of his chair and erupted. Haldeman recalled being absolutely shocked by Helms's violent reaction, saying Helms yelped like a scalded cat. Clearly, those 3 words, Bay of Pigs, touched a live nerve. One CIA source later insisted Helms truly didn't know what Nixon was alluding to, but Haldeman and others suspected otherwise. Veteran journalist Daniel Score agreed with Haldeman that Nixon's mention of Bay of Pigs was code for some deeply hidden scandal, an assassination or something on that order, supposed to involve the CIA and President Kennedy. In Score's words, whatever it was, it led Nixon into trying to enlist the CIA in an attempted obstruction of justice that became his final undoing. To this day, the exact truth behind Nixon's cryptic warning remains elusive. Was he really threatening to expose CIA involvement in killing JFK? We know that by 1972, Nixon had been demanding CIA records on the Bay of Pigs and on the JFK assassination, and that Helms had been stonewalling him. It got to the point that Watergate burglar Frank Sturgis believed Nixon was even in physical danger once he started probing those CIA files on Cuba and JFK. As one account has it, the decision to politically ruin Nixon was made after Nixon demanded to see the CIA files on the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Kennedy shooting. That's a strong claim, essentially suggesting that elements in the intelligence community moved against Nixon to protect their deepest secret. Consider this chilling statement from Frank Sturgis reflecting on Watergate. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that Watergate was a CIA setup. We were just pawns. Sturgis, of course, was one of those pawns, a foot soldier who had done the CIA's bidding in the past and clearly suspected that he'd been hung out to dry. So was Watergate in some sense an intelligence operation rather than a mere political burglary? There are intriguing hints, all those CIA-connected players on the ground, the bizarrely amateur mistakes, like tape left on a door latch that got them caught, the fact that the FBI's acting director Mark Felt, a career intelligence man, became deep throat, leaking secrets to force Nixon's hand. It plays like an espionage drama. Even Watergate's lead prosecutor, Archibald Cox, mused that the case was like a jigsaw puzzle with odd pieces like Sturgis that didn't quite fit. Some researchers, like Jim Hoogan, have argued that the break-in was actually about finding what dirt the Democrats had on the CIA or on the Bay of Pigs crew, rather than just ordinary campaign spying. And Peter Dale Scott, a former diplomat-turned-scholar, famously posited that the secret Cuban assassination plots and their overlap with the JFK murder form the hidden linkage between Kennedy's death and Nixon's downfall. Scott argues that these events are deeply connected, with Castro's would-be assassins and Kennedy's actual assassins and Watergate's burglars overlapping in a way that points to a massive hidden cover-up. It's a provocative theory, admittedly short on proven evidence, but the circumstantial patterns are difficult to ignore. Let's not forget, Haldeman himself wrote that the CIA pulled off a fantastic cover-up to literally erase any connection between the Kennedy assassination and the CIA. He specifically noted that the CIA never told the Warren Commission about its Castro assassination plots, and that the CIA counter-intel chief James Angleton coordinated with FBI Assistant Director Bill Sullivan to script their testimony, effectively sweeping the Castro plots under the rug. Haldeman's source for this claim isn't named, but given his closeness to Nixon, one wonders if Nixon himself passed on these insights. In any case, it's documented that in 1964, the Warren Commission was not informed about CIA mafia plots against Castro, a significant omission later confirmed in the 1970s. When these plots finally came to light during post-Watergate inquiries, even the former President Lyndon Johnson had an aha moment. LBJ had long suspected that Kennedy's assassination might have been payback for the attempts on Castro. After he left office, Johnson told a reporter that he never believed Oswald acted alone, and thought JFK was killed by a conspiracy organized from Cuba in retaliation for the U.S.'s damned Murder, Inc. on the Caribbean, the CIA's plots to kill Castro. "We were running a Murder Incorporated in the Caribbean," Johnson said, and he feared the Kennedy hit was blowback. Suddenly, Nixon's veiled threats to Helms in 1972 make a bit more sense. He was essentially saying, "Dick, I know about our Murder, Inc. operation. I know what was going on with Castro and perhaps of what came of it in Dallas, and I will open that can of worms if I have to." The irony is thick. Nixon and JFK were bitter rivals, opposite in ideology and style, yet here they are, connected by the same clandestine war in the Caribbean, and perhaps by the same violent undercurrent of history. Picture Nixon in the Oval Office in October 1971, a year before Watergate. He is talking to his aides about digging up dirt on the Kennedys. We have it on tape that Nixon demanded Helms hand over CIA files, not just on the Bay of Pigs, but also on the Kennedy administration's other dirty laundry, like the U.S.-backed assassination of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem. Nixon was obsessed with what secrets the CIA might hold that could damage the Kennedy legacy or provide him leverage. He even had Howard Hunt forge fake State Department cables to make it look like President Kennedy had ordered the assassination of Diem, hoping to smear the Kennedy name. That gives you a sense of Nixon's mindset. He was willing to play with fire, the fire of hidden history, to gain a political edge. But by prying into those CIA archives, he may have signed his own political death warrant. Let's be clear, no official report has ever confirmed a grand Nixon-JFK CIA conspiracy. The mainstream record is that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, or at most with an unknown accomplice, and that Watergate was a domestic political crime led by Nixon's overzealous aides. Yet, when we pull back the curtain, we see the same players and motifs recurring. The anti-Castro vendetta that Nixon helped launch in 1960 draws a line through Dallas in 63 and then through the Watergate arrests in 72. We find people like Hunt and Sturgis at multiple points along the line. We hear Nixon and his aides speaking in shorthand about that Bay of Pigs thing, as if JFK's assassination was the unspeakable elephant in the room. We discover that Nixon's attempt to leverage CIA secrets backfired catastrophically, leading not to his protection, but to his resignation. Perhaps the CIA simply refused to be blackmailed and let Nixon twist in the wind. Or perhaps some figures in the intelligence world actively nudged Nixon off the stage to ensure certain secrets stayed buried. In the end, what we have are tantalizing intersections of historical events. Kennedy and Nixon, two very different presidents, connected by covert Cold War struggles against Cuba and by whispers of betrayal and revenge. We have direct testimony from men like Haldeman that something big was being concealed, the darkest secrets, he called it. We have a U.S. president, LBJ, on record saying he believed in a Cuban conspiracy to kill his predecessor, triggered by those CIA plots. We have CIA Director Richard Helms visibly rattled when the subject arose. And we have Watergate, the biggest political scandal of them all, unfolding as if scripted. So where does that leave us? In a wilderness of mirrors, perhaps? In this anti-narrative, we don't tie everything up with a neat bow. Instead, we acknowledge the uncanny overlaps and the lingering questions. Was Watergate a coup of sorts, a second act of Dallas played out through a third-rate burglary? Did Richard Nixon, so versed in Cold War covert ops, stumble too close to the edge of the JFK secret, prompting the whole Bay of Pigs thing to swallow him alive? We can't say for sure, but one thing is clear: the secrets Nixon and the CIA shared and feared cast long shadows over both the Kennedy tragedy and the Watergate crisis. As Haldeman wrote, those secrets were kept under an extraordinary cover-up. Perhaps they remain so to this day. In closing, let's imagine that dimly lit room again, Nixon muttering on the telephone that Hunt knows too damn much, and a silent understanding passing between powerful men about something unspoken. That something reaches back to the Bay of Pigs and the secrets of 1963. History is often written in ink, but here it was written in code, and decoding it has been the work of a generation of skeptics and researchers. We've connected as many dots as we can tonight, carefully, skeptically. The rest, as they say, is up to you to decide whether these strands form a rope, a noose, or just a tangle of loose ends. The truth may be buried in classified files or in the graves of the people who knew, but the pattern, that pattern is there. Lurking in plain sight, history's official version may just be the tip of a very deep iceberg.